talking about the Eastern Washington Stormwater Manual. Um, I work for Department of Ecology, the water quality section, that specifically in the group that deals with stormwater permitting. And my responsibilities revolve around assisting, providing engineering support to the people who are writing the permits and working on developing and editing the two manuals, one for eastern side of the state, one for the western side of the state. So I've been involved with this since 2009 at Ecology. So I got a long history with what's going on here and how we got where we got. I did not participate in the original Eastern Washington Manual development back in 2004, but I did work with um, the Eastern Washington team to produce an update to the manual that became the 2019 manual. And now we've updated that for the 2024 to be going along with the permit release. And so with each new permit release every 5 years, we will update the manual to match changes to the permit and to catch things that we missed during the previous manual. And so I'll be talking about a few of those things that we missed in the 2019 manual here in this one. But there are some major changes to the Eastern Washington Phase 2 permit. Appendix 1 primarily, and Appendix 1 in the Eastern Washington permit is essentially what we talk about in our manuals. It's how to deal with new and redevelopment projects. And so there'll be a lot of new things here that we're going to be talking about that are different from the previous manual. So going through a quick little agenda, what I want to talk about today is to talk about the updates. What have we changed from the 2019 manual? Go into quite a bit of detail on that. I want to talk about exemptions. Exemptions are things you should look at first on a project to see if you really have to follow the rules of the core elements. But there are limits to the exemptions, and I want to make sure that you understand those limits that are in place in the exemptions. We have some definitions and some thresholds that we've changed from the previous versions that I need to get into detail with and talk about that for a little bit. And then there's some other new items that I want to talk about, source controls and dealing with pollutants other than TSS and dissolved copper and zinc. I want to get into a little bit of a discussion about UICs and how the UIC and the permit interface and when you do what as you're doing it. And if you are following the UIC rule, how you can follow the UIC rule with using items that are in our manual. And then I want to get in a little bit more detail on core elements 5 and 6, which have changed a bit since the previous one. The fact that you have to do what level of treatment you have to do with core element 5 and what level of flow control you have to do with core element 6 haven't changed, but the thresholds for doing them has changed. Then I'm hoping to have some time at the end for general questions. And as Lori said, I'll be taking breaks during the session where you can write questions in the chat, and Lori will interrupt me and ask those questions, or we'll take a break where I ask for questions in general. So let's dive right into this. And so let's start about talking about the status of the Eastern Washington Manual. Ecology released the Eastern Washington Manual in July of 2024 for use. Some jurisdictions have in their ordinances that you must use the latest version of the Ecology Manual, and the 2024 version is the latest version of the Ecology Manual. So if the jurisdiction you're working in has that in their ordinances, then this manual is active for you right now. We like to give people time to get used to the new manuals and to make ordinance changes and adjustments to their permitting rules and things like that. So we don't require that the manual is adopted until June 30th of 27. So you have 2.5 years to go about, almost 3 years to go about getting this manual adopted to use during the final 2 years of the 5-year permit term, and a new manual will come out in 2029. As a matter of fact, we're already starting to look at changes we'll be making for the 2029 manual and the 2029 permit. So that's it's a long slog for us at Ecology to get a new permit out. There is UIC guidance in the manual, and that is effective. That you don't have to wait till 2027 for the guidance that's in the manual on UICs to be effective, because that guidance is based on a WAC, the UIC WAC, and that WAC is in place and has been in place since 2006. So that guidance is in place. And so, other than the UIC guidance, you have some years, some time before you have to pick up adopt the manual. And the manual may have a lot of things in it. You may be looking at the manual saying, well, why is there other source controls in there? Why is there construction BMPs in there? Well, they're used by all of our permits, and Ecology produces more than 20 general permits dealing with stormwater issues. And all 20 of those permits can and should use the manual for guidance. And primarily, it's used by the municipal permits, industrial construction, and sand and gravel permits, but there are other permits that use our guidance as well. So we want to have them all in a single manual. So when we were doing the update from the 2004 manual to the 2019 manual, there are questions about, well, why do we have source controls in the manual? We never use source controls. And so we were explaining, Ecology explained that those are in the manual for the industrial permit primarily, but you will use source controls on commercial and industrial new development under the municipal permit. So what hasn't changed between 19 and now? Well, the first 7 core elements are still there. There are, if you have used the manual in the past, you know that there are 8 core elements, and the first 7 are still there. We have not eliminated the first 7 core elements. We've taken the 8th one out and replaced it with another core element for wetlands. And I'll talk about that much more detail later. Your manual is 1 volume. The manual for the west side of the state is 4 separate volumes. We've managed to keep your manual as 1 volume, and what are different volumes in the Western Washington manual are merely separate chapters in the Eastern Washington manual. And the design criteria for treatment and flow control BMPs has not changed. So if you're designing a biofiltration swale, and you use the guidance from the 2019 manual, design that biofiltration swale, looking in terms of size, width, side slopes, depth of flow, type of grass, type of media, filtration media to put in there. That's all the same. That hasn't changed. So when you're doing your design of the BMPs, things haven't changed. The design for stormwater detention ponds, the outlet structure design is still the same as it always was. So those have not changed. What we've done in our changing is we've tried to get statewide consistency between the text in the 2 manuals when we could do so. We're using a software for the manual. So you're online, if you go to the online manual, the URL was posted on the first page, and Lori has put that URL in the chat, or we'll put it in the chat, so you can access the online manual. We use a program called Flare, and in that program, we can create individual topics. They're called paragraphs of text. And if you use the same text in the Eastern Washington manual and the Western Washington manual, we want to be able to use that same text in both manuals without having to change it twice if we need to edit it. And so we've tried to make these things common between the 2 manuals. We do have not changed the numbers, the BMP numbers for the BMPs. If they are different between the 2 manuals, we've managed to retain the old numbers. Flare allows us to put text in the document that's only in the Eastern Washington manual or only in the Western Washington manual. It selects for us automatically, so it does a pretty nice job of that. But where we can have common text, and a lot of that comes in the design criteria for the BMPs, we are using the same common text. We've gone through the manual pretty specifically to look for repetitive material where we say the same thing in two, three, four places. Uh, Maybe it's slightly different in each of those four places. And so someone will read one of them and interpret things one way and reorder and see another one and interpret things a different way. So we've done the best we can so far to find those. We end up getting lots of questions from permittees and from engineers asking us about our language. And when we get to points where we have different text, we note that down and get that into the next update. And we're already building quite a stack of information that we need to start thinking about putting in the next update in order to clarify things we haven't fully clarified yet. And we are revising text for clarity. We do get questions about what do you mean by this and what do you mean by that? And so we're trying to respond to those in the manual itself so that we don't get the question to us. And asked of us, and slows down your process of getting your project done, and takes away from us away from work we're doing on other things. And we've also reordered some sections. We've changed where the language is in the manual. For example, we've created a brand new chapter 5 for UICs. That chapter was buried inside another chapter, and we've taken it out of that other chapter and given it its own chapter now. So if you're doing UIC, you only have to go that one spot. You don't have to search through the manual to find the information on that piece of information. So let's start talking about things that have changed. And these things I'm talking about up front are things that were actually changed in the permit, in Appendix 1 of the permit. So the manual needs to follow what the permit says. And so things were, when the permit got changed, the manual had to change those. So the first thing that was done is the regulatory threshold of 1 acre. All the way to the permits up to the 2024 permit, there was a regulatory threshold saying if the disturbed area of a project is less than 1 acre, then it is not covered by this. You don't need to have the permit coverage. That project does not need to go through the stormwater controls at all. Some jurisdictions over on the east side of the state have eliminated that regulatory threshold themselves prior to this, but now that regulatory threshold has been eliminated from all for all projects. It's still in place for construction, for ecology construction permits. So if you have a project site that's less than 1 acre, you do not need to get a ecology construction permit, but you probably need to work with your local jurisdiction and work on whatever kind of construction permit you need from them, what kind of inspections they're going to have to do, because you can't get out of doing construction stormwater controls. The threshold for that is down to projects that are 5,000 square feet of new and replaced hard surface. So we've had to change done another couple things. Well, with that eliminated of that, now we need to develop a threshold that projects smaller than this do not need to go through this stormwater manual process, and projects larger than that do. We also need to make a better distinction between when you have a new development project and when you have a redevelopment project. Because with redevelopment projects, there is the ability to not have to do stormwater controls for replaced hard surfaces, replaced impervious surfaces, so that we're trying to get people to build infill instead of going out and building in brand new on spoiled land, but to take advantage of land that's inside and has been built on once, but then build something new on that site. So we had to set a decision criteria between what's new development, what's redevelopment, and we adopted the same criteria as we have on the west side of the state. We've had since 2001 on the west side of the state. And that's if the site has more than 35% impervious surface at the time, at current time, then you are project is going to be a redevelopment project, and if the site has less than 35%, it's a new development project. And the term, using the term site is very specific there, as opposed to project site. And I'll get into that discussion later in this presentation. And so we needed to establish project level thresholds. By project level thresholds, we mean the first set of thresholds you look at when you go through the flow chart. We've had flow charts in our manuals for quite some time. When you go through that flow chart to determine what core elements you have to meet. All those flow charts do is look at the project level, at what you're doing with this project, how much new development you're doing, how much redevelopment you're doing. It used to be you didn't have to look at that until you had a site that was project site that was 1 acre. Now you have to look at it on every project to determine if you exceed the thresholds. And so we've had to set project level thresholds to say this project is big enough to go through the stormwater approval process, and this project is not big enough and doesn't have enough impact on the environment to require that. And so we needed to establish what those are, and I'll talk about that more when I go to the thresholds and I go to the actual flow charts. And we've also used the term, new term for the east side of the state, of hard surface instead of hard impervious surface. We're using a term called hard surface. And hard surface is defined as impervious surface, pervious pavement, and vegetated roofs. That's the definition of a hard surface. What we've done there is we didn't want applicants coming in and saying, well, I'm adding permeable pavement in my parking lot, and that takes me below the 5,000 square foot of impervious surface. So I don't have to, I'm not exceeding the threshold. Therefore, I don't have to do stormwater planning. And we said, no, that's not correct. Permeable pavement is a flow control and a stormwater treatment BMP to deal with the problems you're creating. And you're creating a parking lot that's made of a hard surface. So you need to count that against the threshold, the project's the threshold. So that's why we changed the term to hard surface. And that's been in place and been working quite well on the west side of the state up to now. So we think it'll be it's an easy adoption, we believe. And in doing these project thresholds, we've now established some secondary core element thresholds. So now the project threshold says, I have to look at core elements 1 through 8. And so I went through the flow chart. The flow chart got to me, says, okay, you have to look at you have to deal with new and replaced hard surface for core elements 1 through 8 and land disturbed for core elements 1 through 8. Now I get to core element 5, which is treatment, and there's a secondary threshold there. There's a threshold of 5,000 square feet of pollution generating hard surface. So now if you had a project that had 3,000 square feet of roof and 2,000 square feet of parking, and you looked at that project and said, now I'm going to the core element 5 and looking at, do I have 5,000 square feet of pollution generating hard surface? I do not. I have 2,000 square feet for my parking lot. The 3,000 square feet on the roof is non-pollution generating. Now I do not have to do core element 5 because I have less than 5,000 square feet of pollution generating hard surface. So we've added these secondary thresholds to decrease the need for putting really small treatment devices in and do really small flow control devices. So we want to make sure that there's enough pollution generating surface to make it worthwhile to actually install a treatment device and to maintain a treatment device. So that's why we set those secondary elements. So even before you look at the flow charts, when you have a project, you're going to look to see if the project's exempt. We are fully aware that there are projects that you need to do, that jurisdictions need to work on just to maintain things. And we should not be putting stormwater controls on it because all you're doing is replacing the same kind of surface with the same kind of surface. And so why should we be asking you to do new things on that? We are asking you to do retrofit projects, which is a separate issue here. This is maintenance issues. These are dealing things with maintenance primarily in these exemptions. The three full exemptions, the first three full exemptions on my slide, forest practices, commercial agriculture, and oil and gas field activities, those have their own rules. They have their own WAC to govern those. And that WAC includes stormwater issues. And so we feel there's no reason for Ecology to get involved in the stormwater controls for these type of practices when there's another entity already looking at them for that. And now and then there are some pavement maintenance activities that are fully exempt, and I'll talk about those in a minute. We also have a partial exemption for some projects, and I apologize. I should have caught this. That should be CE 1 and 2. I thought I made that change. Maybe I changed it on the other slide that's like this, but that should be CE core element 1 and 2. The exemptions are the same on east and west, so that's why I got the MR there. And one of those is there's a lot of pavement maintenance activities that are partially exempt that I'll talk about later. But I want to talk about the underground utility project first and just define what that is. So an underground utility project is installing, maintaining, and or upgrading an underground utility. We're talking water, sewer, stormwater, phone, gas, electrical, all kinds of utilities, buried utilities that are out in the right of way, that are buried out in the right of way and need to be worked on at times, need to be installed, need to be maintained, need to be replaced, all these kind of things. So the trench work that's being done for those things, cutting the pavement surface, the trench width, cutting that, removing the asphalt or concrete or whatever you have to remove, digging the trench, setting that dirt aside for backfilling, exposing the pipe or exposing the place where you're going to be placing the pipe, backfilling the trench, putting new pavement on the trench, and sealing up the edges and then going away. That work by itself is exempt. It does not have to have any of stormwater controls other than stormwater controls during the construction activity. So silt fences, covering the dirt piles if you're going to leave it overnight, sweeping, making sure that if it rains that dirt doesn't run off and leave the site someplace and go out and fill up the catch basins, plugging up the catch basins while you're doing the work, things like that, things that you need to do during construction. It's still not exempt from that. That's the partial exemption. You're exempt from core elements 1, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and 8, but not core element 2. But if that is going to be exempt, it must be the entire project. Okay, you can not be doing anything else with that. So if you're installing 5 blocks of water line, the city wants to extend the water line 5 blocks out because they've changed their urban growth boundary. Now they have to have urban levels of service out that 5 blocks. And so the city goes in and digs a trench, puts in a pipe 5 blocks long, closes it back up. That's exempt. Cool. No problem there. You just have to do core element 2. However, if that line is being extended to serve a new subdivision or a new commercial development 5 blocks down the line, and that new subdivision or development need to install that pipeline, that is not exempt. That is part of the project. That replaced hard surface out in the road is counted against the 5,000 square feet of new and replaced hard surface to determine the project threshold. And you need to do stormwater treatment and flow control on that replaced hard surface. You don't need to do it on the existing, but you need to do it on the replaced. And so there are alternate ways of dealing with that. One of the ways of dealing with that is to do extra treatment and flow control for the subdivision more than you'd be necessary if you have 2,000 square feet of hard surface in the roadway that you need to do treatment for, do an extra 2,000 square feet of treatment in the design your treatment device to handle a little bit higher flow rates in the subdivision to make up for that. Or you can do improvements along the roadway. It's up to the designer, it's up to the city to determine how it's done, but that is not exempt. And we know people have been, we've got reports of projects where the project has come in for a subdivision and the jurisdiction has considered that roadway utility improvement as exempt and not needing to be controlled. It is not exempt. And I'm telling you right now, it is not exempt. And if we find out other people are letting it by, we're going to be pointing that out. So it must be the project all by itself. And it must replace it with in-kind services. You can't be putting a trench in a gravel road and putting asphalt back in over the top. You probably won't do that, but it has to be in-kind. So there we are. There's my soapbox on underground utility projects. You can tell it's important to me. So here's back to that same slide I had earlier. Apparently I didn't make the change on the slide. I apologize again. But we're talking about maintenance activities here now, pavement maintenance activities. So what do we mean by maintenance? So in the glossary of the Eastern Washington Manual is a definition of maintenance. And this is the definition. Currently serviceable structures. So it's activities conducted on currently serviceable structures, facilities, and equipment that involves no expansion or use beyond that previously existing and results in no significant adverse hydrologic impact. Maintenance, you're taking care of existing problems in your surfaces. Asphalt, concrete, whatever the surfaces are, but we're not increasing the size of anything. We're not anything new. We're not going down to base course and bringing the roadway back up. We are doing maintenance activities, and we're just make it so that the whatever it is can last longer and can work better by being by having this happening. And so, what are these activities that we identify as being maintenance activities? These are actually listed in the manual. This is a copy of the bullet points we have listed in the manual. So pothole patching, square cut patching, targeted preservation work, overlaying, including grinding and overlaying, so long as the base course is not exposed. So you can, if you want to grind 6 inches of asphalt and grind it 2 inches and replace the top 2 inches, that's maintenance. You can do that from curb to curb. You can't extend it any. That's not maintenance. But you can go from curb to curb with that. Okay. You can overlay it. Shoulder grading. If you have a road with a shoulder and you need to grade it, that's fine. You don't have to do anything. Reshaping, regrading drainage systems, including curb and gutters, crack sealing, and maintenance, vegetation maintenance within the right of way. We also, when you're doing, we've kind of done a little expansion when you're doing square cut patching or grinding and overlaying. If you're doing these maintenance activities, and by doing these maintenance activities, you're coming up against corners that are currently curbs, and you need to, because you're under a federal mandate or state mandate or a jurisdictional mandate, to replace the existing curbs with ADA curbing. You can do that ADA curbing as well. We consider that part of the pavement maintenance. But you can't build a sidewalk. You can't repair the sidewalk going on down and do those changes at the ADA changes at the ends of the sidewalk. This has to be up against the road improvements. If the road improvement maintenance is happening, it comes next to that and is what triggers the need to make that ADA adjustment. Then that ADA adjustment is considered part of the exempt pavement maintenance. But it has to be part of the exempt pavement maintenance project to be considered maintenance in this exempt terminology. I'm sure there's going to be questions about this. So pavement maintenance subject to core element number 2. Okay, so removing and replacing concrete or asphalt roadway to base course or subgrade or lower without expanding the impervious surfaces and repairing the roadway base or grade subgrade. You need to, these are not fully exempt, these are partially exempt. You need to do core element 2 when you're doing this. So you can go into a road and from curb to curb, take it down to base course and replace all the asphalt from curb to curb and move forward and go ahead. That's still, we're considering that maintenance in Eastern Washington. In Western Washington, that's replaced impervious surface. But in Eastern Washington, we still consider that to be maintenance. So you can go down to base course and rebuild the road, but you can't expand it. So this is the idea that that road is in such bad shape that square cut patching and other stuff just isn't going to work. And the existing asphalt is only an inch thick or 2 inches thick, and grinding it's not going to work. I'm going to just have to take it out. Well, we're still saying that's maintenance for you. You still have the ability to do that as maintenance. And except for the fact you need to do core element number 2 while you're doing that. Other pavement maintenance items subject to core element number 2. So these have to do with overlaying existing gravel with asphalt or concrete without expanding the area coverage, or overlaying BST with asphalt without expanding the area coverage. So what you're doing here is you're taking an existing road that may be gravel or BST, and you're replacing it with an asphalt with a surface that is much more impervious. I know we call gravel impervious, and there's all kinds of complaints about that, but gravel is impervious because we're looking at the future when the gravel has been torn up and broken and everything. But the way that runoff from gravel roads get away from the right of way, and the way the runoff from impervious surfaces like asphalt get out of the right of way is different. And so we want to make sure that if you're changing it that much, changing the runoff characteristics to that extent, that you're doing appropriate stormwater controls for those things. And so you can do that if you're not, if your roads are subject to traffic volumes that are low enough. We're going to call these, we'll call this maintenance, and you only be subject to core element number 2. If the traffic volume of that roadway is higher than 7,500 AAVT or 15,000 AAVT in rural roads or freeways, then you're no longer exempt, and you have to look at the flow charts. You're now going to be calling this new hard surface, and you're going to have to count that against the thresholds and determine whether you have to do all 8 core elements or not. And we have the same thing for parking areas. If you're going to go down a base course for parking areas and bring it back up to or you're going to change a gravel parking area to an asphalt parking area, and you have more than 40 trip ends per 1,000 square feet of building or 100 total trip ends, you're going to have to call it new hard surface and count it against the thresholds for new hard surface. It's no longer a maintenance activity. We had to pick numbers. We picked numbers. People can argue with our numbers. Some people think those numbers are too high. Some people think those numbers are too low. So it's we think if we're being yelled at with equal volume from both sides, we're probably doing okay. So that's kind of our what we're doing here. And now, what maintenance activities do not do? They don't change the characteristics of a roadway, changing a 4-way intersection to a roundabout. They don't increase the traffic capacity of a roadway, and they don't expand the area of coverage. So if somebody has a project and they are doing one of these things, you'll know they're not maintenance. All right, so let's talk about thresholds. Yay, project and core element thresholds. So as I said before, we've eliminated the regulatory threshold. We established a new redevelopment boundary when you go from new to redevelopment at 35% impervious on the site. We're establishing thresholds using hard surfaces now. And we've got some secondary core element thresholds that we're bringing in to play now that we didn't have in play before. So there are, when you're looking at a project and you're wanting to go through the flow charts and determining what core elements you have to meet and what you have to meet and what surfaces you have to meet them for, they're going to be very different under the 2024 permit and manual than they were under the 2019 permit and manual. And so let's get into some definitions here. So hard surface is an impervious surface, a permeable pavement, or a vegetated roof. I talked about that earlier, that we're trying to make sure that people don't try to sneak out of exceeding the 5,000 square foot impervious surface threshold by putting in permeable pavement. So now we've got a catch-all of hard surface and replaced hard surfaces. These definitions again are in the glossary. If you don't want to come to this presentation, but you want to go to the glossary, that's where I suggest you go. A lot of questions that we receive, we can answer by sending people to the glossary. So be aware that there's a glossary at the end of the permit and there's a glossary at the end of the manual that contain almost nearly all the words you need to have. So replaced hard surface or replaced impervious surface. There's two different categories here. One is for structures, and for structures, it's the removal down to, i.e., exposing the top of the foundation and replacement. And for other hard surfaces, it's the removal down to exposing the top of bare soil or base course and replacement. And we had a question this week about somebody who was asking, what is the term replacement referring to? This term right here, replacement. What does this term replacement refer to? Well, it refers to what got removed. So replacement refers to what got removed. So if in a structure, I removed the roof and the walls of a building and I replace that with another building, then that is replaced hard surface. That building then becomes replaced hard surface. If I remove the other hard surface, if I removed an asphalt surface and I replaced it with more asphalt, that becomes replaced hard surface. Except you're doing maintenance for you guys. So it's kind of an interesting question about when you have a replaced hard surface and when you don't have a replaced hard surface, because of the maintenance definition there of I'm replacing hard surface and only requiring core element 2. We're not trying to make things complicated here, but we want to make sure that you know what these definitions are, because these definitions are going to be at the flowcharts, and they're going to be numbers that you have to generate as you start doing your project, so you can go through the flowcharts and determine what core elements you have to meet. So here's the new development flowchart. It's revised from what you saw before. It's pretty straightforward. The first question is, does stormwater runoff from the project site discharge to a class 5 UIC well? And all is the key term here. And if it does, if your project sends all the runoff from your project site to a class 5 UIC well, then you need to follow the UIC rules. And so you need to go to chapter 5 of the manual and follow those rules. and you don't need to follow the permit. You don't need to go through the thresholds. You don't need to go through the core elements. Everything you're doing is under the UIC rule. You're putting in treatment under the UIC rule, and you're registering your UICs under the UIC rule, and you're meeting all of the non-endangerment standards, and you're meeting all the requirements for deep UICs if you have a deep UIC, and all the other requirements that are in there in the WAC for UICs that aren't in there for a permit. And I have a little bit of discussion later about why we're doing this and what's going on here. So if you answer no to that question and you're not putting 100% of the 100-year storm into UICs, then you're going to be covered under the permit and have to do the core elements. Now we need to determine, are you a redevelopment project or a new development project? If your site, note the term site, if your site has more than 35% of existing hard surface, you are a redevelopment project and you're going to go to another flow chart. If you have less than 35%, you're a new development project. And now we want to know, are you adding more than 5,000 square feet of new plus replaced hard surface, converting 3/4 acres or more of vegetation into lawn or landscape, or converting 2.5 acres or more of native vegetation to pasture or lawn or landscape or whatever is more. If you add those three triggers, those three levels have about the same impact on stormwater. You increase the amount of runoff from a site if you have 5,000 square feet of new hard surface, or you change 3/4 an acre of vegetation to lawn, or you change 2.5 acres of native vegetation to pasture. You get the same impact. That's why we have all three of those there. But we also want to control things where all people are doing is disturbing the land. Somebody comes in and removes trees from 3 acres, that's an impact on the environment, and we want to do stormwater controls on that. So if you answer yes to any of those three, all of the core elements apply to the project. And you must look at elements 5 and 8 for the new and replaced, and 6 for the new only. And I'll talk about why those are different later. And so there are also additional thresholds in core elements 5, 6, and 8, those secondary thresholds you have to look at to see if you really have to design for those. You have to, the flow chart tells you, I've got to go look at core element 5 and determine if I need to follow core element 5. It doesn't say I have to follow core element 5. It says I have to look at it. That's what this flow chart tells you. And now the redevelopment flow chart is a big change from what you're familiar with. It starts out the very same way that the new development, by looking at UICs and sends you over there. It also has the reverse question about 35% of existing hard surface coverage, and takes you off this chart if it's less and sends you back to the first chart. But you shouldn't have to have gone through that at all. But we're just wanting to make sure someone doesn't go to the wrong flow chart first. We get them the right one. And then it has the first question. It has the same first question as the new development one has. It's asking, but it's only asking for new hard surfaces. First question on the other flow chart, and I go back. First question on this flow chart was new and replaced hard surfaces. What we're doing on the redevelopment flow chart is we're only asking about new hard surfaces up here. So it's a little bit different from the new development flow chart. And if you answer yes to that, then you get the same answer here, only you have to do 5, 6, and 8 for the new hard surfaces and converted vegetation areas. The previous one, it was the new and replaced hard surfaces. for 5 and 8, and new for 6. Now it's the new for 5, 6, and 8, and it doesn't say anything about replaced there. What we're going to do with the rest of this flow chart, all the flow chart beyond this question and beyond this answer of no, is we're going to decide, do I have to do flow control and treatment on the replaced hard surfaces? Again, we're trying to get people to do infill. And if they don't have to do flow control for the replaced hard surfaces, that's going to make their stormwater cost less and make them more likely to want to build internally. So the next thing we do once we get to that is we look to see, do I have a road related project? And so let's assume it's a subdivision or a commercial development or something like that. So I'm going to answer no there, and I'm going to look at, are the new plus replaced hard surfaces 5,000 square feet or more? Now we've added replaced hard surfaces to that question over above this question. So we might have answered no to this, but we may answer yes to this one, or yes to this one down here. And does the cost, the value of the proposed improvements, exceed the assessed value or replacement value by 50%? Have they made that site more valuable? If all they're doing is replacing asphalt in a parking lot, they haven't made it more valuable. Why are we asking them to do stormwater controls on a surface that's still the same surface it was before they did anything? We don't want to make them do that. But if they're putting a building on that site and it becomes more valuable, we want them to do stormwater controls there. So we're asking, have we increased the value of the site by a certain amount? And we use a different guide to look at what area we're choosing to consider for the cost increase. So for projects that are commercial or industrial projects, and those would be things like multifamily housing, subdivisions, restaurants, industrial sites, commercial buildings, those kind of things. We're looking at the project site. The project site is the area that has been disturbed. And so if the area that's been disturbed is increasing in value by more than 50%, then we answer that is a yes, and we answer yes to both of those. Let me give you an example. There's a, I know there's a large mall in the Richland area. There's a large mall with all kinds of shops and a big parking lot around that. And the site, which is defined by ownership, the site is that entire parking lot boundary. There are the buildings that are on the parking lot, and the whole boundary. That is the site. If somebody wants to build a new TGI Fridays restaurant on that parking area, and they are disturbing a portion of that parking area to build the TGI Fridays, that area is the project site. The site they're disturbing is the project site. And we're looking to see, are they increasing the value of the project site by more than 50%? They're probably not increasing the value of the site, the whole parking lot and retail stores in the mall. They're not increasing that by more than 50%, but they're increasing that what was a parking lot, and they're turning it into a TGI Friday, and that's increased by more than 50%. So we want to look at the project site for projects like that. But for all other improvements, non-commercial, non-industrial improvements, single family houses, schools, community parks, public parks, public schools. We want to use the site improvement. We want to use site as the distinction as to whether it's increasing the value or not, as opposed to project site. We don't want to make a school that has a 15-acre campus, and in one quarter on a quarter acre portion of that 15 acres, they're building a new classroom or set of classrooms. We don't want them to have to do stormwater controls for that set of classrooms when they're already doing stormwater controls for that whole site. So we let a school count as for one of the all other projects. They don't count as commercial or industrial in this context. And if you have a junior college someplace and you want that's a for-profit, you as a jurisdiction can decide if that's a commercial or not. It's up to you to decide. My distinction in my brain, my distinction would be if it's a commercial, if it's a project for commercial profit or attempted profit, I would consider it a commercial industrial building. Facilities that aren't out there for individual profit, I would consider all others. That's my interpretation of this language here. And the other engineers at Ecology are interpreting it similarly. So I'd suggest that the jurisdictions we should interpret it that same way, because if Ecology's asked, that's how we'd interpret it. That's the answer we would give a jurisdiction. And if you've answered no there, it's not greater than 5,000 square feet, and you aren't increasing the value, but it's still a commercial industrial site. And are you adding 50% or more to existing hard surfaces within the site? You still have to do controls. And you're going to have to do controls on the replaced hard surfaces. So that's what we're getting at. If you come down through here and answer yes to either of these boxes, you're going to have to do stormwater controls on the replaced hard surfaces for treatment and wetlands. But for flow control, you only have to do it for the new hard surfaces. Now remember, if you have a redevelopment project, you have existing hard surfaces. And if your replaced or your new hard surface flows go across those existing hard surfaces, you need to include those existing hard surfaces in the sizing of your treatment and flow control. You have to size the device for the flow rate arriving at that device. We have similar type of questions there for road-related projects. So if there's 5,000 square feet or more of new and replaced hard surface in a road-related project, and are you adding more than 50% of the existing hard surfaces within the site, then you have to do the full new and replaced hard surfaces. If not, you don't have no additional requirements. What we've done with adding these plus replaced hard surfaces in those questions is we're trying to get more roadway being treated, more replaced roadways being treated, more cases where we're adding a lane to a road and all we're having to do previously was treat the runoff from the new lane. Now, if you're putting in enough new lane compared to the amount of existing surfaces, we're asking you to do stormwater controls for the new and replaced surfaces. I've got my next group of slides are going through this same discussion in a little different manner. I'm not looking at the boxes, the flow chart. I'm going to talk about each one in a separate manner. You can, as a jurisdiction, you can decide whether they're and for that box, you can decide yourself whether they're commercial or industrial or not. But
And
you
that's
have to be, but you have to have the same answer for everybody. So you can't say, okay, this nonprofit is not commercial, but this nonprofit is. So you have to follow the same rule for everybody. Well, we're talking about building things. So are they putting in a new building or I mean this is for new and redevelopment projects. So um, they they need to um, it needs to follow the flow chart and works its way down the flow chart. And then when you get to that question um, in the flow chart, if it's a redevelopment project, and you get to that question, then you as a jurisdiction can decide if you want to call that a commercial project and look at the value increase of on the project site, or you want to call it a non non-commercial project and look at the cost comparison for the site. That's up to the jurisdiction to make that decision. Not if you don't do anything to the roadway still existing pavement. You only have to do things for the new and replaced hard surfaces. You don't have to do stormwater controls on existing. So if all you're doing is putting in those pullouts and you're not doing anything else, and those pullouts total more than 5,000 square feet, you need to do flow control, or you need to do treatment on those, because what's gonna happen is they're gonna be too small to have to do um, flow control. You're not gonna have 10,000 square feet under the secondary threshold. If you're just using it, keeping the roadway existing, you're not bringing in the replaced. Now, if you're going to be replacing the road at the same time, now you're going to have to do stuff for the entire road.
they added, Doug, that it's a resurfacing project for the roadway.
Well, if all you do is if you don't expose the base course, if all you do is grind and overlay, that's maintenance. That's not replaced. That's not replaced hard surface. You have to go through the process and determine and look at the definitions and identify what is new hard surface, what's replaced hard surface, what's existing hard surface, and put the surfaces in those categories, and then you can go through the flow chart. This is all new to you. I'm fully aware of the fact that this is all new to you. Maybe the first time many of you have even seen this. So I understand your brains are exploding right now. Um, if you follow the process of developing a table that says of new hard surface, new pollution generating hard surface, new replaced hard surface, replaced pollution generating hard surface, do these categories. You may have zero, but do those categories, and you have those numbers, then you can go through this flow chart pretty quickly. And all we're trying to do with these flow charts is to determine what surfaces you have to deal with when you start looking at the 8 core elements.
That's all the questions in the chat, Doug.
Okay. Yeah, I think this whole thing is very new to the people on the east side of the state, so it's understandable. I'm available for questions when a project comes into you, your jurisdiction, and a project comes into you, and you want to decide what you need to do, or if you're an engineer trying to decide what to do, call me up, and we'll walk you through it. So let's continue on looking at the redevelopment criteria, but let's look at it in a different way. Instead of looking at going through the flow chart, let's just go and say, what do I have to do? So all redevelopment projects are going to if you have more than 5,000 square feet of new hard surfaces, or you convert 3/4 acres or more of vegetation to lawn or landscape, or you convert 2.5 acres or more of native vegetation to pasture, you have to consider core elements 5, 6, and 8 for the new hard surfaces. That's an automatic. And there's nothing different between what we had in place in 2019 and this language. Exactly the same, and it's exactly the same as new development. Okay, so the first step in the redevelopment, looking at redevelopment, that first box up at the top, really is identical to the new development flowchart. You've got to do core elements 5, 6, and 8, which are treatment, flow control, and wetlands. And you've got to do that for the projects that exceed these thresholds. Okay, what's new here is you could have had a project that added 20,000 square feet of new hard surface, and you didn't have to worry about it because the project site was less than an acre. Now that 43,560 square foot number disappears, and you're now at 5,000 square feet. So there's a whole bunch of projects that did not have to look at new and redevelopment in 2019, now have to start looking at new and redevelopment. And so that's one of the things we're trying to do with this change. We didn't realize at the time we thought about making this removal of the 1 acre threshold, how it would impact the new and redevelopment spreadsheets, flowcharts, and we found we opened a can of worms, and we're trying to control and put into a tight little bin. So 5, 6, and 8 are required for the new hard surfaces and converted vegetation areas for anything that exceeds those numbers. Now, do we add replaced hard surfaces? Okay, so let's start out by looking at non-road related projects. Shall comply with all the core elements if they meet either of the two. I'm going to give you two thresholds in the next two slides. And so if they meet either of the two thresholds, they're going to have to do core elements 5 and 8 for the new and replaced, and core element 6 for the new. Okay, you already have to do core element 6 for the new. You're not adding anything new to core element for the new hard surfaces. You are adding 5 and 6 for the replaced hard surfaces. If you exceed these thresholds, it's not automatic. There's a threshold in here. So the first threshold is that top of that first box. You're adding 5,000 square feet or more of new plus replaced hard surfaces. So we've gone from looking at new only to new and replaced. And have we increased the value on the project side by more than 50%, or the value on the site for the non-commercial industrial projects by 50%? Okay, this is what that first box was asking us. Do we have more than 5,000 square feet of new plus replaced? So if we only had 3,000 square feet of, if we had 3,000 square feet of new and 3,000 square feet of replaced, we answered no to that first one, but now we're answering yes. And if we answer yes to this, we go back and we have to do 5 and 8 for the new and replaced, and 6 for the new. Threshold number 2 was that bottom box, and now this is for commercial industrial sites. Are we adding more than 5,000 square feet? And does the new plus replaced total 50% or more? You got to do both. And if we do both, then we've added 5 and 8 to the new plus replaced. That's taking us through those boxes in the flowchart. So each time you hit a box in that flowchart, you now have to determine, do I meet what's in this flow chart, this box, or not? And if I do meet what's in that box, I have to add something. Okay, so let's go back to the box, the flow chart. So I come down to this box. I'm down in this box. Do I meet both of those things? If I do meet both of those things, I'm coming down here and I'm adding replaced hard surfaces. I've already got the new hard surfaces up here, or I may be going here and missing that, but now down here I got yes, I have to do both the new and replaced for 5 and 8, and the new for 6. If you answer yes to a box, you're going to be adding something. I answered yes here. I now have to do core 5, 6, and 8 for new hard surfaces. I answered yes here. I'm adding new and replaced hard surfaces. I added, if I say no here, and I come here and say yes, I'm adding something. If I say yes there, I'm adding those. If I say yes to those, I'm adding something. If I say no, nothing additional. So you're moving things forward. So road related, if they meet both these thresholds, I gotta do core elements 5 and 8 for the new and replaced, and core element 6 for the new. There's a lot of new stuff for you to deal with, to kind of decide whether your heads are up for it today or to not. It's very confusing. It's very new to you. It's been in place on the west side of the state since 2001. So they're very familiar with this, and we still get questions of how to follow the flow chart fully. So it's not something you can pick up in a day. And it's something you have to look at every single project individually. There's no generalization here. These are very specific, and you have to look at the numbers for each project. So this is something that the design engineers are going to need to get used to, because they're going to have to start building in their report these tables of types of surface and the amount of those types of surface. They no longer have just, am I bigger than 5,000? Yeah, okay, I got to do it. Now, depending upon how big you are and where you are and what you're doing, you may very well have to do different things. And you may be bringing in different things. And if runoff from new surfaces flows across existing surfaces or flows across replaced surfaces, whether you have to deal with replaced or not, you still have to deal with all that runoff. You still have to size your BMP to handle the flow coming from that entire area. You can't just handle the flow coming from the new. So when you start designing things and you start looking at how water flows on the site, that may end up killing all this extra work, because you may end up having to deal with runoff from replaced surfaces anyway. Because the water you're collecting and treating came from replaced surfaces. But we're not requiring it. Okay, so let's get away from those thresholds. Let's set those behind us and pretend we all understand them completely and don't have anything else to do with them. So let's talk about our new core element 8. Core element 8 is on wetlands. Ecology has a group of people in the C section, shoreland and environmental assessment group, that are focused on wetlands. And they have told us that we need to start looking at wetlands across the state to deal with impacts on wetlands of new and redevelopment. And so we have elected to do that through the generation of a new core element 8. And if you remember what we talked about in the thresholds, that core elements 6 or 5 and 8, you need to do new and replaced hard surface. And core element 6, you don't need to do new. So we've brought that into the threshold calculations. So it's there. And what we've done to help people figure out how to deal with wetland protection is we've created a new appendix, 2D in the manual, discussing wetland protection guidelines. Some of the standard guidelines that you need to be aware of at all times is there are wetland buffers, and the buffers change size depending upon the value of the wetland. Buffers can be as much as 200 feet in some cases, depending upon the value of the wetland. We want to make sure we're not doing any activities in the wetland, make sure we're not compacting or or putting invasive plants into the wetlands. We want the wetlands to be made with native plants. All treatment and flow control measures that you have to install under core elements 5 and 6 must be complete prior to runoff going into the wetland. You cannot use the wetland or buffer as a treatment BMP or a flow control BMP. Those are not allowed. The only case where you can use the buffer as a part of a flow control BMP is if you are using dispersion. You are allowing runoff to run across a grassed or vegetated area, and it has to go a certain distance in order to be acceptable. And you can use the buffer as part of that length of flow for the dispersion BMP. So if you need 100 feet of dispersion and you're only 50 feet away from the buffer, you can disperse over that 50 feet and use 50 feet of the buffer to provide you additional dispersion length. That's okay because the water is fully dispersed. It gets treated before going into the buffer, and water flows across the buffer into the wetland anyway. So we're not causing additional problems. What we want to do with the wetland guidance is we want to maintain hydroperiod controls. We're looking at the water levels in the wetland. We don't want them to go up or down a lot more than they are currently going up and down. When you're looking at the impacts on wetlands, we're also looking at the comparing what the new development will have, the impact the new development will have on the wetland. We're comparing that to the existing condition, what the wetland is currently experiencing. We're not asking you to look back to foresting conditions, what the wetland was seeing under foresting conditions. We're assuming that wetlands that are in place now are working well within based on the existing conditions. So we're looking at the changes to the hydro periods between current conditions and mitigated conditions with the new development in place. And what may happen here is in order to avoid having problems to the wetland, we may come up and find out that our flow control requirements are too strict and they don't allow the wetland to work properly. And so we then, in that case, we say the wetland controls override the flow control. And so if you, we'll ask you to do as much flow control as you possibly can without harming the wetlands, without hurting the hydro periods. What we're trying to do is avoid drying out the wetlands. And our guidance looks at a month by month water levels in the wetlands based on flows going into and out of the wetlands. and we're trying to avoid drying them out. And so we are fully aware that if it doesn't rain, the wetland's going to have no water going into it. And the fact that it doesn't rain is the water going into the wetland does not depend upon whether you've done something at a project site or not. The wetland won't get water during the dry periods of the year. And so what you do in your development is not going to really impact that. So we allow for some wetland, for the wetland water levels to drop during dry periods if needed. But we don't want them to drop too far because if a wetland's in balance with existing conditions, it's probably getting some groundwater to feed it. And we want to have it maintain that flow. We don't want to hurt that flow that's going in there, but we don't want you to stop that flow. So we ask you not bypass waters around a wetland. If water coming off your site is already going to a wetland, it needs to continue going to that wetland after your work. So there's some other things we wanted to talk about. In the manual, we don't have strict guidance for these things yet, but we want to let people know that we are aware they're happening and we are doing things about them. And so one of those things is climate change. We are aware of climate change and we don't know what's going to happen, what climate's going to be like in the future. So we are working with the University of Washington to see if we can get help from them to identify what rainfall is going to look like in the future, what kind of how much rain we want to get for various return events, and we've just started a contract with the University of Washington climate people to do just that, to take their projections. They've made a number of rainfall projections based on different assumptions about the ozone and the climate and how things are going to change. And we're asking them to take their big projections and make them smaller projections so they can relate to Eastern and Western Washington. What we are putting in our recommendations at this point in time is we're asking that jurisdictions begin thinking about preparing for more extreme events. We're not telling them what size that extreme event should be. We're asking UW to help us determine that. It's not our place yet to do that. We don't have, Ecology doesn't have enough knowledge to do that. We're asking that you apply more infiltration and green infrastructure in your planning. That keeps that'll keep the larger storm events on site and not get them out into the collection systems, which could become overwhelmed and flood, and not get them out into the streams, which could cause flooding. And we're asking that you do preservation and enhance existing BMPs that you have in place, do the maintenance that you have, if you can make them more robust without large costs, do modifications that you can do. We're hoping that that's what we can get done in the near term. We're asking that we're talking about that in our manual. What we are doing is we're trying to develop future precipitation information. We're looking to upsize historic rainfall data to match some future scenario for rainfall. We know that the current thinking right now, I can't necessarily say we know this, but current thinking right now is that future rainfall events will be larger in intensity and shorter in duration. So the hydrographs that we have for our storms will no longer be the same. They're going to go higher and they'll be shorter over time. We don't know exactly how much higher and how much shorter, but that's what we're asking UW to help us with. What we are also asking them to do is to create isopluvial maps for the state of Washington, which we will, once they are produced, we will post those. If they're produced before 2029, when we release our next version of the manual, we will post them in the emerging guidance section in on our webpage. If you go to the page where you can access the online version of the manual, over in the top left-hand corner, there is a additional information tag to click on, and that is a drop-down menu. And in that drop-down menu is a emerging guidance tab. And if we do get new isopluvial maps, we will post those new isopluvial maps in that emerging guidance section with the manual so that people can use them. When they're in the emerging guidance section, they are available for use. Ecology has identified them as being something that we can back, but we don't require that you use those. We require you use things that are in the permit and in the manual, and if it's in the emerging guidance, we don't require that you use what's in the emerging guidance. If we're going to require it, we have to go out for public hearings and do all kinds of things like that, which we will do with the 2029 manual, and we will bring things in from emerging guidance into the 2029 manual, and we'll use that process to get where we want to do. In the meantime, you as a jurisdiction are free to decide what you want to do. There are multiple ways of going about dealing with future growth, future changes to rainfall. One, you could upsize you could identify what your design water quality treatment level is, CFS or volume, depending upon if you're using a volume sized or a flow sized PMP, and you can take that number and multiply it by 1.2 or 1.4 to get a larger flow rate or volume for that treatment PMP. That's perfectly all right with Ecology. We don't have a problem of you doing that if you want to. You'll have to convince the local engineers and developers that that's something that they need to pay for. But you can do that. You can't use a number less than one, but you can multiply it by something if you want. You can also take the rainfall amount from the isopluvial maps that are existing and increase those by some percentage. If you want to do that and have the designers use that number, those are both appropriate. The problem with changing the rainfall is it doesn't come into play with the shorter storms. And so just by increasing the rainfall amount won't get your detention facilities to react properly or react how they would be acting in the future with the shorter storms, because these storms would be going for too long a time. But there is something on the horizon to deal with climate change. If you as a jurisdiction want to be proactive, Ecology won't stop you from doing that. But Ecology is indeed working on a procedure to change those isopluvial maps and to look at new hydrographs for storms. And when we get those will be things that Ecology will want jurisdictions to do. And you can do something on top of that if you want, but you'll be required to do at least those items once we get those developed. And we're getting it developed for statewide all at once. So we will be able to release everything at one time. And so DOT will have their information statewide at the same time as everybody else gets theirs. So climate change, we are working on. I don't know when we're going to have an answer, but we are working on it. Our contract with UW is for 2 years, so I wouldn't expect much in less than that. We also are discussing nutrients and toxic organics. They're big in the news today. 6-PPD and 6-PPDQ is very big in the news, killing Coho salmon. It's nationwide. It's ubiquitous, and it's everywhere. A lot of parts of the country don't really care about it right now because they don't see it as being a toxic to the fish species that they have. However, it is toxic to those fish species, whether they believe it or not. So most of the country isn't jumping on the bandwagon quite like Washington State is jumping on the bandwagon. We've got lots of studies going on. We're trying to determine how to deal with it. We just don't know enough about 6-PPD to say what we can do about it. We have no idea about what concentrations we should be expecting from different land use types. We have no idea about what concentrations we should be removing 6-PPDQ in order to protect aquatic life. We don't know what BMPs can treat it and how well they can treat it. So we can't really say you must treat for 6-PPD and then say, oh, well, we don't know what you can use, but you got to do something. Well, that's not fair to you. And so we're trying to figure out how to give you the correct tools and tell you what tools there are and how to size and use those tools appropriately. There are a bunch of other toxic organics, PAHs, PCBs, PFAS, all things that are in the news right now. These are more drinking water related than they are stormwater related toxic organics. But stormwater gets into the drinking water by going into the ground and then into the aquifer. And because many people on the east side of the state have aquifers that are sitting below their community, we need to be worried about these things going into the ground. We've put in some discussion in the manual on land use and what you expect from certain places. And we've also identified some source controls and some runoff treatment BMPs that can deal with some of these. We don't know how much removal we can get of these things, but we know because of their chemical makeup that we should be able to get certain kinds of treatment. Certain kinds of treatment devices should provide certain levels of treatment. And we're finding that out in doing field tests that is true. And so we identify some of these treatment devices that can get those treatments. And we're letting you know about that. We've also added some source controls, BMPs, to protect against PCBs particularly. PCBs were used in paint in between 1980 and 2000, around that area. And so we have guidance in the manual that if someone's planning on doing washing or repainting of buildings that were built during that time period, that they need to test for PCBs in the paint. And if they indeed find PCBs in the paint, that we now have some source controls that we have in the manual for jurisdictions to use or for painters to use while they're doing the paint removal, so that the paint and the PCBs in the paint won't get into the stormwater system and cause problems in the stormwater system. So these 4 source controls are now been modified to address PCBs. They've been in the manual for since 2001 probably, but they've been modified to address PCBs. And we have a high performance bioretention soil mix that was identified and developed in the early 2020s. And we put that in the that mix in the emerging guidance at that point in time. And in the 2024 manual, we brought that mix into the manual. It's no longer, we now have this in addition to the default mix for bioretention soil media. It is for use when you have phosphorus issues for the water that has gone through the bioretention. If you don't have phosphorus issues, we suggest that you use the default mix. It's much less expensive and much more available on the east side of the state. I know we've been trying to obtain HPBSM in Spokane for a grant project and have been having a great deal of difficulty, and it's much more expensive. So we don't, at this point in time, we don't recommend you use it unless you absolutely have to use it, but it is in the manual. The manual contains in the bioretention BMP section of the manual, it contains the information you need to design a bioretention facility, regardless of what media you're planning on using. All the media use the same default infiltration rate, same reduction factors, the same sizing, the same slopes. They all use the same design criteria, regardless of which mix you have. There is a specification for the default mix in the manual. We did not put the construction specification for HPBSM in the manual. We realize that we may want to change that over time. And if that construction specification is in the manual, we won't be able to do that. We can't edit the manual except when it goes out for going out for public comment. And if we want to change the spec, we can't do that if it's in the manual. So we've kept the construction specification outside the manual, and it's in the emerging guidance section. So if you need to use HPBSM on a construction project, and you need to specify that in your construction specifications, go to the emerging guidance and take the specifications, the construction specifications, which is an appendix in that document, and put that appendix in your construction specifications. There are a lot of tests that must be done on the various different medias that make up the HPBSM to make sure that they are appropriate for the HPBSM, that they're not bringing phosphorus into the mix. For example, they're not bringing nitrates into the mix, so that we're not exporting those values. That's one reason it makes it be so expensive, is those materials aren't readily available in Eastern Washington. So if you are going to use it, and we want you to be using it only when you have to, if you're going to use it, you must use that construction spec out of the emerging guidance. And we've gone into more detail to identify that all BSM must use a 12-inch per hour initial infiltration rate, and then you use a correction factor of either 2 or 4, depending upon the area draining to it. We realize that bioretention soil media infiltrates much higher than 12 inches per hour. That's a given. We know when you first install it, that's going to happen. We're not worried about what's going to happen when you first install it. We're worried about what happens if it's been in place for 10 years and hasn't been properly maintained. And now the infiltration rate is only 12 inches per hour. We want to make sure it's sized large enough to handle that. And we want to make sure it's sized large enough initially so that people will know it's there, that it's going to take up space. And so that 12 inches per hour gets us to do that. And then in our UIC, we've added much guidance for UIC. We've updated it a lot for clarity, and we've added language for deep UIC wells. Deep UIC wells are wells that are poked through a confining layer, not necessarily 20 feet deep. If there's a confining layer 4 feet below the surface and you poke your UIC through that into the aquifer underneath, that's a deep UIC well. And there are a lot of new requirements for that. And those requirements were, the language of those requirements were negotiated through the Association of Water and Wastewater Districts. So we've confirmed with the Association of Water and Wastewater Districts and Department of Health that the language we're putting in there is they consider protective. So questions on that last little bit of changes, and I'm going to go to, from here, I'm going to go to talk about UICs. Underground injection controls are governed by WAC 173-218. And they developed a guidance manual in 2006, which is when the WAC was introduced. And Ecology has taken the information in that guidance document that's cover page is shown here, and we've moved that into the manual. And in Eastern Washington, it's in Chapter 5 of the manual. And there are some trade-offs between whether you want to follow guidance in the manual or the UIC guidance. And one of those trade-offs is UICs, there's no minimum guidance, minimum disturbed area for UICs. So if you have a project that has less than 3,000 square feet, or less than 5,000 square feet of new plus replaced hard surface, and you're taking care of runoff from the driveway with a UIC, and you're installing a UIC, that UIC you are now have a UIC governed by the UIC rule, and you have to register that UIC, and you have to submit that UIC to Ecology for registration. This threshold was much more important when we had the 1 acre guidance. So somebody could have a 20,000 square foot of new and replaced hard surface project, and they were using UICs. They didn't have to go through the submit for the permit at the time, but they were covered under the UIC rule at the time. So they may have been using UICs and not following the rules necessarily. Now, when it goes down to 5,000 square feet, you're going to be, even if you're using UICs, you'll probably be submitting for permit compliance. And UICs require that you retain all runoff on site. They don't allow you to discharge to the MS4, and you have to treat and infiltrate all the runoff, not just 91% like you do under the permit. So there's some differences there. So I'm sure most of you know what a UIC is, but let's get on the same page. So UICs are bored holes that are deeper than the largest surface dimension, or a dug hole, or a improved seek hole, all of which you look at the largest surface dimension and compare that to the depth. And if the depth is greater than the largest surface dimension, then you have a UIC. Now, if you have a trench separate from a dry well or these other point holes, if you have a trench one of whose surface dimensions is definitely going to be larger than the depth, you fall under bullet number 4 here. And so that's a subsurface fluid distribution system with an assemblage of perforated pipes, drain tiles, or other mechanisms to distribute fluids below the surface of the ground. So an infiltration trench filled with sand, if it has a perforated pipe in it, it is a UIC. If it doesn't have a perforated pipe in it, it's not a UIC. So if you have a trench filled with sand, a pipe coming to it that pipe stops as it enters that sand trench. Water moves through the sand slowly. It's driven by the head developed at the end where the pipe comes in to move through the device. That's not a UIC and doesn't need to be registered. But if you have a perforated pipe in there that takes water the entire length of the trench and uses the entire length of the trench for infiltration, you then have a UIC. So typical UICs are dry wells, drain fields, infiltration trenches with perforated pipe, and storm chamber systems with the intent to infiltrate. So these things, as you're seeing on the left here, these chambers, if you're using those chambers for infiltration, they are considered UICs. If you've if you can't infiltrate, if the ground is such that you can't infiltrate, and these are being used for storage for a detention system, these are not UICs. You have to be doing infiltration in order for these to be doing UICs. So not UICs, buried pipe or tile networks that collect water. So an interception drain. So you have groundwater, you have high groundwater on a site, and you're building a building with a basement, and you want to intercept the groundwater before it gets to that basement. So you put a trench in the ground, fill it with sand, put a perforated pipe in that, collect the water that you've intercepted, and drain that to the surface. That's not a UIC. Water's going the wrong way to that pipe. A UIC water has to be going into the perforated pipe and then into the ground. If water's coming from the ground into the perforated pipe and out of the perforated pipe to the surface, that's not a UIC. Surface infiltration basin, so an infiltration pond, that's surface dimensions are larger than its depth. So it's probably not a UIC. And if you don't have perforated pipe in the infiltration trench, you don't have a UIC. So we manage stormwater here in Washington State one of two ways. One through the NPDES, Municipal General Storm Sewer MS4 system, and or the underground injection control. The UIC program manages infiltration, various different liquids being put into the ground, not just stormwater. So our interrelationship is with the UIC program with the class 5 UIC wells, as opposed to all of them. So UIC covers many more things than just the stormwater. So the two programs do overlap. The UIC program has in its text that you should get the design, construction, operation, and maintenance information from the manual, from the stormwater program to fulfill their ACART requirements. And so all known available treatments, the requirement is to meet ACART. And so if they use the BMPs that we have in our manual or to meet the UIC rule, then the UIC rule, its requirement for ACART is met. And so here's how we deal with the two of them in the permit in section S2A of all three of our municipal general permits. The phase 1 and the 2 phase 2s, we identify that this permit itself authorizes the discharge of stormwater to surface waters into groundwaters of the state from MS4s owned or operated by each permittee. And section S1A is a listing of all the permittees, all the cities and counties that are covered under this permit. So it's authorizing discharge from the MS4 to waters of the state. Right next to this, in the very next paragraph, it says that discharges to groundwaters of the state through facilities regulated under the UIC program are not authorized under this permit. So you can, a jurisdiction, an MS4, has authorization to put water into the surface waters through the permit, and they're authorized to put water into the ground in any manner but through a UIC. And if water is coming from the MS4 through a UIC, that has to be authorized by the UIC program, hence needing um, to submit the UIC for approval and authorization. And in the Eastern Washington Manual, we kind of carry that on a little bit by saying to recognize that the UIC, the permit, does not authorize stormwater to or from UIC wells unless the overflow and discharge from a UIC well drains to a MS4. So if a UIC is designed to infiltrate the 10-year storm, that 10-year storm flow goes in through the UIC. But if you have a larger storm and that larger storm goes out of the UIC and discharge into the MS4, then the MS4 permit has to apply to the well now. So so that's why we go back to looking at on the flow chart, clear back to the flow chart, that first box on the flow chart, we identified is all runoff go through a UIC well. And if it's not all runoff going through the UIC wells, then we're going to get this bypass, this overflow from the UIC well into the MS4. And now the MS4 is responsible for that water getting discharged to the ground and wherever it gets discharged to once it gets into the MS4. So now the MS4 needs to have the permit authorization for the water going into the ground. And so where do we deal with this? How do we deal with this? And so there's one other piece coming up in the Eastern Washington Manual in S5B5 paren 2 of the Eastern Washington Manual. It says that all permittees shall require projects approved under S5B5, which is the post-construction BMP section of the permit. You must retain the 10-year 24-hour rainfall or a local equivalent on site. So here's where you will probably be using a lot of UICs. If nothing else, you'll put a UIC to retain the 10-year 24-hour rainfall event. But that's not all the rainfall that's going to fall. So you'll have to register that UIC with the state because it's a UIC, but you'll have to follow the permitting rules because you haven't kept all runoff on site through UICs. And Ecology had to come up with a definition of what we mean by all. We're not going to require that you put in, you meet all the rainfall from the largest possible storm. Now, we've had these hurricanes hitting down in the Southwest with a lot more rain than anyone ever designs for. Well, we could have that. We have these occasional atmospheric rivers that come through, and the amount of rain that we can get from an atmospheric river may be larger than we would really want to design for cost effectively. So Ecology came and said, well, what are we going to consider the storm that you have to design for? That if you design for this storm and all the water from this storm goes into the UICs and no discharge off site from that project, you are under the UIC rule and not under the permit. And so we decided that storm would be the larger of the 100-year 3-hour or the 100-year 72-hour storm. So there's a volume amount in each of those storms. And whichever one's larger, that's the one that we're asking you to size the UICs for. And if the UICs can handle that amount of water, you go up to the flow chart and you answer yes, all the water in the UIC is going to UICs, therefore I'm under the UIC rule and I'm no longer under the permit. If you can't answer that question, then you're under the permit. And what we're trying to do is we're trying to protect groundwater. And so by protecting groundwater, we're asking for there to be a separation between the base of the well and the top of the groundwater table. And the groundwater table is defined as the seasonal high water, which quite often on the eastern side of the state is during irrigation season. On the western side of the state, it's during winter, but on the eastern side of the state, it's during irrigation system. So we're asking for you to determine the seasonal high groundwater label. We're asking you to install BMPs for treatment and source control prior to going into the UIC, to not do any prohibited discharges from the UIC program, to meet your local ordinances, and register your UICs. So if you're going to be using UICs on your project, if you're going to be putting all runoff into UICs, we're asking you to follow these, look at these things. The separation between the UIC well base is called the vadose zone. And we're going to be asking for vadose zone treatment capabilities. So once you're in the under the UIC rule, the thing you need to do beyond registering it is you need to provide some sort of treatment prior to putting water in the UIC. So how do we determine what that is? We have a 3-step process. Step number 1 is we look at what kind of pollutant loading we're going to have. And we rate that on low to high. And that's typically based on average daily traffic. We think that traffic is the major cause of pollution here. We also want to know what kind of treatment you can get in the vadose zone. The unsaturated soil between the bottom of the UIC and the top of the seasonal high groundwater table. And that gets graded on a high to none. And then we use the pollutant load and the vadose zone classification that we just determined to determine the specific BMPs necessary. So each of these has a separate matrix. So our first matrix looks at vadose zone capacity, ranging from high to low, high to none, I think, actually, when you get down there. And each of those thicknesses, there's a minimum thickness amount, and you need to have these characteristics of the soil within that whole 5 feet, not just at the bottom of that 5 feet, but throughout that 5 feet. If you only have 2 feet of this, then you don't have high, you go down to medium. And these first bullets, 1, 2, 3, 4, those 4 bullets match, and for the high capability, match with what we call our site suitability characteristics, SSC, in the manual. So if you're wanting to do soil, you want to use existing soil for treatment in the manual, your soil must have these characteristics as well. And it's in PD grain size, infiltration rate, and CEC capacity. And then there's some descriptive terms for what we're talking about here. Well, typically what we want is you to look at those first 4. And so you're going to select, you're going to identify which one. If it doesn't meet the correct characteristics of one, you go to the next one. If it doesn't meet that, you go to the next one. And you find the one where it meets. Then we're going to look at the area contributing to the UIC. And we have insignificant loads. Those are places where there's no pollution. No vehicles are there, unmaintained open space. That's insignificant. Low, we have numbers for parking areas and other land uses. So we have parking areas with more trip ins, more use, and down here in high, we have high use sites. high use sites are defined in the glossary. So you don't just say, I don't know what a high use site is. Go to the glossary and read what we're calling high use sites. There are specific land use, specific trip ends, specific industrial sites are identified as high use sites. So you go through these, you identify which one of these your project site is in. If it's not low, it's bigger than those 40, go down to 40 to 100. And then once you find out those two numbers, you go to this table, table 5.6.4 in the manual, and you find your treatment capacity and your pollutant loading. And you look to see what kind of treatment you have to have prior to going into the UIC. So these little A's, B's, and C's are footnotes that I don't have on this slide. And those footnotes say that a two-stage dry well is a catch basin with a downturned elbow. Pre-treatment are BMPs that have met the pre-treatment criteria of tape. So they're hydrodynamic separators. And removed solids are treatments that have met the requirements for basic treatment, TSS removal. Note we don't have metals treatment in this. We don't have phosphorus treatment in this because water's going into the ground, and we're not metals treatments there for streams and protecting fish in streams. And in the places where it says remove oil, you don't need to remove oil from the entire site. You need to put the oil treatment BMP near where the potential for oil spills is likely, and where runoff from those areas goes to a certain point. And so for a gas station, for example, where you need to have oil control is in areas around the pumps. So you would put a catch basin to collect all the water from the area around the pumps, and you would drain that to an oil water separator, and that's your oil treatment. And then you probably need to do some more sediment removal beyond that. So that's how you determine what kind of treatment. That's the main difference between what the UIC rule requires and what the permit requires, is the amount of treatment you have to do before you put water into the ground. They both require that you do an assessment. You make sure that you have a well assessment for that UIC. You have O&M and outreach and education for that UIC, that you have a construction SWIP when you're building it, and you have a stormwater management plan for that. Now, the UIC rule allows jurisdictions to use their general system-wide, MS4-wide stormwater management plan to identify what they're doing for their UICs, but they need to include the UICs in the stormwater management plan. So if UICs have municipal UICs, if jurisdictions have municipal UICs, they must design, construct, operate, and maintain all new UICs according to the guidance in the manual. They must conduct a well assessment for each existing UIC. And they must conduct a stormwater site plan for the area served by each municipal UIC. So you still have to maintain them. You still have to operate these UICs in accordance with what's in the MS4 or in your permit. It's just the amount of treatment prior to the UIC and the fact that a UIC gets registered with the state. And what's a well assessment? Well, you got to identify potential risks. Got to look at the land use, the local geology, the depth of groundwater. Are you in a groundwater protection area? Is it a deep UIC? It's not a deep UIC. You have to look to see if it's a potential threat to groundwater. And if there is a water purveyor who uses groundwater for that aquifer down gradient from your well, and you're in their groundwater protection areas, you need to converse with them to talk to them about what you're doing and to find out what they want and what DOH wants to be in place to help them identify if there's a potential threat to their groundwater. And jurisdictions can incorporate UICs in their stormwater management plan by doing all these things, registering the new and existing, design, construct, and operate and maintain them according to the guidance in the manual. And existing the UIC's definition of new wells and existing wells is unusual. Existing wells are wells built before 2006, and new wells are wells built after 2006. So there's a lot of existing wells that we don't know about. If you discover an existing well, you need to let the state know and register it. When I talked about the threshold flow charts, I said those tell you whether you need to look at all 8 thresholds or not, but that some thresholds had secondary thresholds. Some of those core elements had secondary thresholds, and core element number 5 is one of those. So you look and on your project thresholds, do I have more than 5,000 square feet of new impervious surface, new and replaced impervious surface for a new project? Well, when you get that, I do have more, but now, and it tells me that I have to look at core element 5. So now I'm looking at core element 5. And core element 5 says, do I have more than 5,000 square feet of PGIS, pollution generating impervious surface? I'm not saying new or replaced. I'm saying, do I have more than 5,000 square feet on my site of PGIS? If I do, I have to provide basic treatment for this project at a minimum, unless I'm discharging to a qualified UIC facility. And that means a UIC facility that's accepting 100% of the runoff and is designed in accordance with what we just talked about, as the treatment we just talked about. Or my project satisfies the full dispersion BMP, and the full dispersion BMP means I've set aside 62% of my site to be a stormwater collection area, and the site I have has no more than 10% impervious. I've designed the site in this specific way. I'm doing full dispersion. That's what we mean by full dispersion. If you're not doing that and you're dispersing water on the site in some manner, that's not full dispersion. So you still have to provide basic treatment. Our goal is to use 90% of the annual, is to treat 90% of the annual runoff. Treating 100% of runoff is cost prohibitive. And if you want to use infiltration for treatment, you don't want to treat on the site, but you want to let the water go into the ground and be treated. You have to meet the site suitability criteria. Remember, that's the stuff that I talked about being up there in the high treatment in the UIC. It talks about infiltration rate, talks about sizing of the material, it talks about cation exchange capacity, it talks about compost and organics, it talks about location of contaminated soils, it talks about slopes. There's a lot of things in that site suitability criteria that all have to be met if you want to use infiltration for treatment. And you may need to treat for metals, phosphorus, or oil additionally, depending upon the site, the project site, what you're doing up on the project. And we've created a chart for you that, depending upon how you're just getting rid of the water, you can flow down through here and look to see what BMPs are potential for you for treatment. You've identified what treatment you need to do. And now you've gotten to the point where you need to identify what BMTs can do that treatment. And you could use this chart to get you there. So if you're a combined sewer area, you can just see local requirements. If you're using evaporation pond or full dispersion, you're done. If you're doing subsurface infiltration, meaning UICs, you're going to go to the UIC rule. If you're doing surface water or surface infiltration, you need to follow these flow charts down. And these flow charts are going to say, do I need to do, you're going to make your decision. Do I need to do oil control? If yes, pick an oil controls BMP and come back in. If I need to do phosphorus, come out, pick a phosphorus. Then do I need metals as well? If I need metals as well, here's the treatment devices I can use, and my selection is done. If I don't need to also do metals, my selection is done. If I don't have to do phosphorus or metals, I have to do basic. I'm down here on the end. And then surface infiltration, you follow it that way. So determine up here which type of way am I getting rid of the water, and then follow that for the, how do I determine what BMPs I can treat. Before you come to this, you have to look at your site and you have to go through the process to determine what chemicals you have to treat for, what pollutants you have to treat for. If you have to treat, we've given you a, you have to calculate what my flow rate is or my volume is. And we've given you 5 methods to determine the design volume. We've given you 3 methods to determine the design flow if you're doing this before detention. And if you're putting your treatment after detention, we've told you how to make it. Now, these are approved by Ecology. What most jurisdictions have done, and what I suggest you do if you're a jurisdiction and have not done this, is you select one of these methods so that everybody who submits to you is using the same method. You're not having to learn different methods and determine if those methods are okay or not, and if those volumes or flows are okay or not. So we suggest you pick one of those methods. Now, if you have to do core element 6, there's a secondary threshold there as well. And the threshold is 10,000 square feet of total impervious surfaces, or a 0.15 CFS increase in the 25-year, 24-hour event over existing conditions. 10,000 square feet of new impervious surface gives you about a 0.15 CFS increase in the 25-year. We picked this larger number because flow control tends to be large and take up a lot of space. And if it's less than this, there's not really much of a stormwater impact. So we're not forcing people to do flow control on these smaller projects. So you could have had a project with 8,000 square feet of new and replaced impervious surface, and it told you to come here to core element 5 and core element 6. And core element 5 said 5,000 square feet of pollution generating impervious surface. And that 8,000 square feet could have been made up of 5,000 square feet of a building and 3,000 square feet of parking. And so you didn't have to do treatment because you were less than 5,000 square feet of pollution generating impervious surface. And you didn't have to do flow control because you're less than 10,000 square feet. But if you put it into UICs to get rid of the water, you have to follow that UIC rule for treatment and put some sort of treatment before you put it into the UIC. So you're not necessarily, if you're going to use a UIC, you're not necessarily out of treatment. You still have to follow the UIC rule for treatment. There are exemptions that you can go right to, not even have to worry about the 10,000 square foot threshold. If you can disperse everything without discharging the total 25-year volume, if you discharge your irrigation return flow streams, discharging to flow control exempt water bodies, discharging to a wetland with no surface water outlet, or if you have flows only during runoff producing events. The flow control exempt water body, just because you have a flow control exempt water body at the end of where the water goes, the Columbia River, for example, or the Snake River, for example, your project isn't flow control exempt unless you meet a couple of additional requirements. And those additional requirements is the flow path from your project all the way to the flow control exempt water body must be constructed. Pipes, ditches that are owned and maintained as part of the MS4. And you have to have adequate capacity in that alignment to meet the full build out expected flows going down to that flow control exempt water body. If you don't do that, if you discharge into a stream that discharges into the Columbia River, you're not flow control exempt because you're receiving water as that stream. For flow control, Ecology would prefer that you use infiltration. We don't want water coming out on the streets. We don't want water in the MS4. And when you're meeting flow control, if you do have to meet flow control, we want you to retain the 10-year 24-hour event on site without discharge. That's the permit requirement. And we want you to limit peak flow development flow rates to 50% of the pre-developed 2-year peak and maintain the pre-developed 25-year peak rate if you're discharging off-site. So if you're going to be discharging off-site using detention of some sort, you need to run a model that takes the 2-year and it takes the 2-year flow rainfall and 25-year rainfall, run those simulations through the model that includes your detention facility, and then look at and then report the pre-developed and post-developed rates and make sure they're match. You have a match. There are multiple options for your design storm that you use. And when you're doing pre-developed conditions, it's forest or prairie. There should not be any impervious surface. There should not be any landscaping in your pre-developed analysis when you're doing this detention analysis. I want to make sure that's not happening. And conveyance is not discussed in the manual. We don't talk about how big pipes should be, what size storms you should deal with. DOT has a lot of discussion about the size of pipes in DOT facilities. Many jurisdictions have identified pipe sizing. They want the 25-year storm without surcharging. They want the 10-year storm and allow surcharging to the top of the catch basin. Others want the 100-year storm without surcharging or with surcharging. DOT actually allows surcharging to be half the right-hand lane. So if you've been driving down the highway in big rainstorms and you wonder why you're in the right-hand lane and you're driving through a lot of pooled water, that's because that's allowed by DOT. They allow you the conveyance system to back up, but no higher than the midpoint of the right-hand lane. And if you're providing any BMP, you need to provide a O&M manual. Many jurisdictions already have O&M manuals for a lot of the standard BMPs. If you're doing one with tape, you probably need to get the O&M manual from the manufacturer and put that into your O&M manual. If you're putting in things for a privately owned operation, you need to give the O&M manual to the owner so they know how to operate. And lastly, we have core element number 8. We're doing general protection of wetlands. We're trying to protect it from pollutants, and we're trying to do hydro period protection. You can't build a stormwater BMP within a wetland or its buffer. And what we're comparing on the wetland hydro period is against current conditions, not forested conditions. And we're worried about water levels going up and down. And we have a lot of guidance for you on this. And there may be compensatory requirements that the C program from Ecology might require if you damage a wetland or potentially damage a wetland. All things. So if there's a wetland near your project, you need to pay attention to it from the very start. And that completes my full set of discussions. We have a little less than a half hour left for questions. If there's questions on any part of my whole discussion, and there's my contact information. No, we don't. We just don't want you to bring it. We don't want you to add it. If it's there, it's there. We don't have a method to remove it. And at least the water quality program doesn't have a method. The C program, the people who deal with wetlands on a regular basis may have a method, but I'm not aware of what it is. The reason is we don't want you to extract pages. We don't want you to copy them and make edits to them.